Hey everybody, it's Pam Buffet. I work with US Foods. Most of you I probably actually know or have had in my classes before. So sure wish I was there seeing y'all face to face. But since we can't be there, we're gonna do this. So we're gonna talk about food safety and sanitation. A lot of you have been through the training before and are recertifying. The way this is going to work, and I'm sure you've already seen it, but at the end, you have to take a post test, and that's all done through a Survey Monkey. It's going to go to Amy, and then she will get your certificates out to you at the end. If you have any questions during the presentation, all you have to do is go into your chat and type your question in. I'll answer those as we go, or we will wait to the end. We'll just kind of see what pops up, but just be sure to ask questions. Those of you who know me know that I do much better when I have feedback and have lots of questions, because this stuff is so much easier when I can give you examples and different scenarios. And if we've got things we can share, that certainly helps in questions. So we're going to start out with me just kind of telling you why we're here and what we're doing. A few years ago, the Assisted Living Association survey team implemented a policy where whomever is in charge of your kitchens in your facilities need to have some sort of food safety certification. This every 3 years needs to be renewed. I can tell you, for those of you who have taken the class in the past 3 years, even 5 years, the information has not changed significantly. It's just we need to be reminded. So like with anything else, we've all had plenty of reminders to wash our hands in the past few months. So it's kind of the same concept with this. So a lot of this is going to be review. For those of you who are new, I hope to get to meet you soon, and we're going to dive right in. Since I'm not there with you and can't give you the little pre-test like I do before each section, I'm actually going to just go over the questions in the pre-test. And let me say it this way. There are 3 sections, 3 pre-tests, 10 questions each, and your final post-test is 30 questions. Hint, hint. So if you pay attention and get the answers to these pre-test questions that we're going to go through, you will have absolutely no problem at all finishing and passing the post-test. The biggest key here is I want you all to know where to find the information and have heard it, and at least know where to get your answers. Okay, so just a couple of things on the pre-test, and since I'm not there with you, I'm just going to kind of go through these questions. But foodborne illnesses are preventable if we all take the proper precautions. Okay, it's just like anything else. If we're paying attention and do what we're supposed to do, we can certainly prevent foodborne illnesses. The way we store food is going to be important. Okay, we're going to talk about different types of hazards: biological, physical, chemical hazards. Just because a food doesn't have an off smell or a taste certainly doesn't mean that it's safe to eat, and I'll get into some of that. Chemicals, we're going to talk about how we store chemicals. They have to be kept separate from food and have to be in a secure location. Let's see, salmonella, cross-contamination is a big deal with that. So if we have cooked poultry, cross-contact with a raw poultry product, then certainly we could have some potential for contamination there. Anything with our raw meats, the very most important thing is to store it on the bottom shelf. And I'm going to talk about each of those things, okay? So the first thing you can see on your screen is actually some pictures. And I've had these pictures for a long time, but I always make sure I tell y'all these are not staged. These are real pictures that we have taken in different locations that we've been in, and we use them as examples. And so what I always like to ask you here is, what's wrong with this picture? And someone told me once it would be better to say what's right with it, because that would be a much shorter list. So as you can see from the first picture on your screen, the first thing we notice is the raw celery stored right on top of your raw meat. The meat isn't cooked. We all know that that's not how we're supposed to store food. The next thing, you can see the shelves look a little bit rusty, so we've got some issues there. On this particular picture, we've got salads that are open, food that's uncovered. We have meats stored in the plates where they're not covered, stacked on top of each other, and uncooked and ready to eat food stored together. Here we have ribs. You can really see the rusty shells now with this particular picture. Those are raw ribs in the boxes. And then we have cooked, ready to eat ribs that are uncovered and stacked. And I know those pictures seem very blatant. Nobody walked into work that day and said, I'm going to store the celery on top of raw meat. And that's what we have to remember, is nobody thinks that that's okay. Everyone knows that that's not proper storage. However, when we get in a hurry, when we aren't paying attention, when we have too many things going on, when we have inadequate staffing and the same person is having to cover 3 people's shifts, I know that never happens. When that happens is when things get missed. So that's why we like to do these food safety reminders, so that we can help you to help your teams not miss these things. And again, if y'all have any questions, please go ahead and submit them as we go throughout the class this afternoon, because I can answer them, or if I know that it's coming up in the next slide, then I'll just let it come up in the presentation. So potentially hazardous foods. Let's talk about this. Potentially hazardous foods can be any food at all. Now, there are some foods that have more potential to become hazardous than others. The first thing I always ask is somebody name me one food that is very common with foodborne illness. And the number one thing, if I could hear every one of you right now, you would be saying chicken, because that's everybody's first response, and that's very true. So the common characteristics are foods with a high moisture content, foods with a lot of protein, foods that are neutral or slightly acidic, and that's all of our center of the plate items. That can be chicken, beef, pork, seafood, eggs, all of those things. And those are the first things that we think of. However, there are lots of foods that can become hazardous because they get contaminated during processing or production. Many of you remember, gosh, it's probably been 10 years ago now, that we had the huge Peter Pan peanut butter recall nationwide, and you couldn't find Peter Pan peanut butter on the shelf forever. And that is because in many places where peanuts are grown, it's often the type of climate where poultry is raised. And what happened with Peter Pan all those years ago is raw peanuts were crossed over through the wrong part of the warehouse, and they contaminated the already cooked peanuts. The raw peanuts had been contaminated with salmonella because of the groundwater. Again, and I grew up in that part of the state where peanuts and poultry farming are the number 1 and 2 things in that area. So oftentimes raw peanuts are naturally contaminated because of just the nature of where they're grown. Well, these peanuts were carried through the wrong part of a warehouse. There were also bird droppings on air conditioner vents that dripped into the cooked peanuts. So that is what caused the huge Peter Pan peanut butter outbreak probably 10 years ago or more. I did have people after that say they would never eat Peter Pan peanut butter again. And my comment to that was, my reply was, it's probably the safest peanut butter out there right now, because right after that happened, you can bet they were the ones that were paying the most attention to every little detail. So any food can become contaminated. We've had E. coli in raw spinach. We've had E. coli with lettuce, salmonella in tomatoes coming out of Mexico a few years ago, had some jalapeno issues. So it can happen with anything. And that's the key here today, is to remember that. All right, the three types of hazards we're going to talk about: biological, chemical, and physical hazards. Biological hazards are the most common. They're the most widespread, and the easiest way to remember which hazards are biological hazards is to remember those are all the big words that you see on TV that make you real glad this isn't a spelling test today. So that's your salmonella, your E. coli, your listeria, all of those things that you see and you hear about the outbreaks. Those are biological hazards. Chemical hazards are exactly what they sound like when chemicals, which could be detergents or sanitizers, come in contact with ready-to-eat food. So that's your chemical hazards. Physical is anything physically in that food that can be removed. It could be bugs, fingernails, hair, Band-Aids. I'll give you tons more examples later on. But let's talk about biological hazards first. Again, they're the most widespread. It's because the bacteria and the viruses are not destroyed and the food is consumed by the human. It grows in our intestines, makes us very sick. You can become sick within a few hours. You can even, some of these bacteria may take 2 or 3 days to grow and make you sick. And again, that's part of the reason that foodborne illness is so underreported, because most of us can't tell you what we ate yesterday, much less 3 days ago. And so many times we just think we ate some bad Mexican food the night before, when in all actuality, it was something that we ate that caused foodborne illness. So it can really happen with anything. Salmonella, E. coli, I didn't mention norovirus. Norovirus is the #1 foodborne illness in America. And the reason for that, in my opinion, it is very easily spread, extremely easy to spread, and it's what we call the cruise ship virus. So all of the cruise ships that you see that are quarantined and you know, kept out at sea, and you have all these people getting sick, it's 99% of the time it's norovirus that causes that. So, and it's just very, very easy to spread. All right, so that's your biological hazards, your salmonellas, E. coli's, staphylococcus, norovirus, listeria, all of those, okay? Chemical hazards, exactly what they sound like: detergents, sanitizers come in contact with food. These aren't as common, simply because if you accidentally spill Clorox or some sort of cleaner, you know that. You see that it splashed into your food. It makes your food taste different. It makes it smell different. So there's lots of reasons that you don't consume it. You know that it's been contaminated. However, you can eat the best chicken salad you've ever had in your life and it be heavily contaminated with salmonella and make you as sick as you've ever been after you eat it. So that's why the chemical hazards are not as common. Another type of chemical hazard is the contamination with toxic metals. This could be using a cast iron skillet to cook something that's highly acidic, a tomato-based product, a vinegar-based product, anything that's highly acidic, because what can happen is the acidic nature of the food causes the iron in the skillet to leach into the food. Another example of that is orange juice in a pewter pitcher. And it's getting to be the holiday season, so that's when we all bring out our pewter serviceware. So just be very mindful of not putting highly acidic foods in pewter pitchers or on pewter serviceware. I can give you an example of a chemical hazard that happened to one of my co-workers. A friend of his was down in the Gulf Coast and consumed some excellent fresh caught seafood. This was a few years back. He got very, very, very sick, and they were actually able to trace it back to the actual fisherman and what waters that he caught that particular fish in. And they discovered that that fisherman, in order to be able to stay out at sea longer and to get a heavier weight in his catch, he was soaking the seafood that he caught in a formaldehyde solution, and it made the seafood very plump. It made it weigh more, therefore he got more for it. However, this person that got really, really sick lost most of his intestines, part of his stomach, and is forever changed because some fishermen made an extra few cents on his catch that day. So again, that's an extreme example, but definitely contamination, and that was a chemical hazard. How do we prevent chemical hazards? We purchase from approved vendors, of course. Again, we all like to use the organic cleaning supplies. Most of us aren't mixing our own, but there's lots of things we like to use at home that we can't necessarily use in our facilities. You've got to make sure that your chemicals are being purchased from approved chemical suppliers, and your grocery store is certainly an approved chemical supplier, but you have to make sure it's for commercial use and from an approved vendor. Chemicals have to be stored separate from food and kept secured, which means in a locked closet or in some sort of secure area where your residents cannot access it. You can't store chemicals with your food, and it has to be secured. The next slide, or a couple of slides, are some pictures of some actual deliveries. And I just want to give you some examples here of what not to do on storage. And the reason I show you these is I want you to be mindful of your deliveries. And when your deliveries come in, make sure someone is there to check them. Make sure that food, of course, isn't being left out for extended periods of time, but you also want to make sure that if your food is being brought in on pallets, that the pallets are stacked appropriately, and certain foods are stored and stacked and delivered as they should be. On this particular pallet, and it's a little bit hard because I don't have a little red laser pointer up at the screen to point to, but you can see the big bucket right there that says Ecolab, and all of those items right around that big 5-gallon bucket are chemicals. There is some, I believe it's grapefruit or excuse me, tomatoes on the bottom. That's fresh produce. Right on top of the produce is a box of raw chicken, and the brown box in the back is raw ground beef, and I'll give you a little better picture of it here. So you can see that's a close-up of the grapefruit, which is raw and ready to eat, of course, and then the raw chicken that's sitting on top of it. Here's a picture of the backside. You've got potatoes with raw ground beef sitting on top of that. And let me tell you a little story behind these pictures. Nobody in the warehouse woke up that day and said, this is how this pallet is supposed to be stacked. What specifically happened in this case is this very large institution's products are delivered on multiple shrink-wrapped pallets. Because there was other customers' product mixed in on one of those pallets, the actual driver, the delivery driver, had to dismantle the pallet and move this location's product onto a separate pallet so that he could deliver it. He was in a hurry. I'm just guessing that if that was wrong with his deliveries that day, he was probably frustrated. He was probably running behind, because guess what? They're human. We all are. And so he was just getting that product onto a pallet so that he could get it delivered. Bottom line, he was trying to get it to the customer. What the mistake he made is that he wasn't paying attention to what he was stacking. The moral of this story here, of course, is it gave us the opportunity to do some training with our teams, our driver teams. But the person who caught this had just been through one of these food safety classes, and he happened to be on the loading dock as this pallet was rolling by. So he went to his supervisor and he said, "Hey, I was just in that class and they just taught me that you're not supposed to put chemicals, produce, et cetera, all on the same pallet." His supervisor was able to check it out. Of course, gave this guy lots of kudos for catching that. And this gentleman was actually later promoted to be the receiving clerk, which was an actual financial and title promotion for him. So because he paid attention, he was able to catch something, of course, to keep his patients and residents safe, but also help educate the rest of his teams and catch something that needed to be caught. So those are some extreme examples, but examples of how mistakes get made. Physical hazards, again, are anything physically in that food that are not supposed to be part of the food. Bugs, fingernail, hair, Band-Aids, chips of glass, metal fragments or dishes that may have chipped off. I see a lot of metal shavings when you're opening a can with a can opener. The reason for that typically is your can opener blade needs to be changed. It's either, and make sure that you're cleaning your can opener blades as well. If there's one item in a kitchen that probably is the most heavily contaminated, it's the blade of the can opener. Because think about it, it touches every single food item that you're opening, and hopefully you're cleaning and sanitizing those. So metal shavings off of your cans as you're opening them certainly can be a physical hazard. There's lots of other examples. A good rule of thumb on your can openers, if it is starting to rip the paper all around the can, then it's time to replace it. That's just a good rule of thumb to keep in mind. As far as your dishes and chips off your serviceware and your dishes, plates, bowls, cups, etc. If you have, and I know right now it's such a weird time and we're not serving in our dining areas, but once we're back to being able to have our residents congregate and eat in dining rooms and enjoy each other's company again, if you have dining areas that are away from your kitchen, for example, you may cook in a central kitchen, deliver food down a hallway to another pod in bulk, and then it is served from there onto the plates and dishes to the residents in that dining room. Make sure that whoever is doing the serving in that dining room knows that they should be keeping an eye on their plates, bowls, cups, those sort of things, because it may be dishes that never come back to the kitchen and may be washed and stored right there in that particular pod in that kitchen. So make sure the rest of the teams know, whoever is serving down there, whether it be care assistants, nurses, or food service staff, whomever it is, just make sure they know they can help you out by keeping an eye and letting you know if something is chipped or broken. Light bulbs, I didn't mention this. Light bulbs is another potential for physical contamination. We use shatterproof light bulbs, or we keep covers over our light bulbs in the food prep area in order to prevent our food from getting glass fragments if a bulb were to shatter. And believe me, it can happen. It has happened. So also just make sure your bulbs are appropriate for the part of the kitchen you have them in, and that they're either covered or shatterproof. Keeping your small wares in good condition. Probably every one of us has cooked eggs with a rubber spatula and then it curls up on the edge. And I always laugh and say, I don't know if I've got scrambled eggs or scrambled spatula at that point. So our spatulas, if they're not made for high heat, they will curl up and crack huge areas for bacteria, and also they can break off into the food. Make sure we're using the proper tool for the job. It's one of all of our favorite things is to grab a butter knife because it can do anything. But if you have knives that have the ends broken off of them because you've used them as a screwdriver. Maybe you've hired a new cook. That cook is not, you got to make sure all of your tools and your equipment is in good condition, because they're not going to know if that was already broken or if it just happened. So just make sure we're using the right tool for the right job. Regularly review your food handling and your storage techniques with your team. I had a dishwasher once who was the very best dishwasher that I've ever had, and I discovered that he was actually able to grab like 5 plates at a time in between all of his fingers and stack them up and run them through that dish machine. But I had more broken dishes than I had ever had also. So it's good to be fast and it's good to be efficient, but it's also good to make sure that we are properly handling all of our dishes as well, because you got to make sure they're not cracked or chipped. Foodborne illness and preventing it and keeping our residents safe is everybody's responsibility, not just the cooks, not just the managers, not just the food service team. Certainly it applies to anyone who's coming in contact with the resident, with the food, serving food, etc. And I know right now it is a little bit different. I get that. But we still have to keep in mind that it's everybody's responsibility. Time temperature abuse, we'll talk about that. Cross-contamination, personal hygiene. We've probably all had plenty of personal hygiene training in the past 6 months. How we handle food, and then of course we've talked about caring for and storing our utensils. I want you to remember the temperature danger zone, and I'll refer to that more than once for the rest of the session. 41 to 135 degrees. This is the range of temperatures that the CDC has determined that bacteria or microorganisms will grow the most rapidly. This is exactly why we say hot food hot and cold food cold. So 41 or less is where our cold food is, 135 or above is for our hot food. So what we want to do is minimize the amount of time that food is inside that temperature danger zone. You can't keep it out of that range, but we can minimize the amount of time that it's kept there or held there. We have to make sure that food is received at the correct temperature. Again, this kind of goes back to your deliveries, having someone there to check in your deliveries as they are being made, making sure that your products are in good condition, they're not damaged, and you need to pick 1 or 2 refrigerated items to make sure that they are 41 degrees or less, because if they're in the danger zone when they're delivered, you don't know how long they've been there. So you have to make sure that you're receiving food at the right temp, because once you receive it, then it's your responsibility to make sure that you're keeping your residents safe. Another thing to keep in mind here is for those of you who shop locally, whether it be Sam's or any situation, Costco, where you're not having food delivered to your back door. If you are going out to Sam's to pick up groceries for your facility, please make sure you have a way to keep them at the proper temperature in transport from the store back to your facility, because you need to make sure that your cold food is cold, 41 degrees or less, once you bring it into your facility. We have to hold and store food at the correct temperature. If your food is being delivered to you and you don't have a huge walk-in refrigerator that your refrigerated items can just be rolled into, you need to make sure that you are immediately putting away those refrigerated items. They have to go first, because those are going to be your most critical items. And again, you need to take the temperature of 1 or 2 of those. You certainly can't check the temperature of every item on every delivery, but you do need to pick a couple and make sure that food is being delivered to you at the right temperature. Using proper thawing techniques, we'll talk about that, because there is a way we can contaminate food while we're just trying to thaw it out, and we certainly don't want to do that. Cooking and reheating food and cooling food properly. Let's talk about cross-contamination. Cross-contamination is when microorganisms are transferred from one food to another, or from one surface, meaning my hands, my spatula, my apron, my gloves, if we're not properly using gloves. So there's tons of ways that food can become cross-contaminated. The number one food we always think of is poultry. And it's just about making sure that we're educating our teams and we're handling food the way we know that we should. Improper hand washing in between raw and ready to eat or ready to serve food. Just changing your gloves isn't good enough. And I'll talk about this in the next section, is we've got to have clean hands inside clean gloves, bottom line. Improper cleaning of prep surfaces. How many times have you sat down at a restaurant and the server came and wiped the table off with a rag they had tucked in the top or the side of their pants, and who knows how many other things they had wiped with that same dirty dish rag? It happens. Doesn't happen now like it used to, because we're all extremely mindful of those things, thank goodness, more so than we've ever been. Uncooked ingredients added to a cooked product and then not heated properly. Good rule of thumb, anything that is a potentially hazardous food, make sure it's cooked before you're adding it to cooked product, or that it's going to be fully cooked after you add it. Not storing food properly. If we don't store our raw foods below our ready to eat or ready to serve foods, then certainly they can drip down into our foods and contaminate it. And I mentioned the dirty, unsanitized work cloths. Cutting boards is a huge place where we cross-contaminate. Just rinsing off the cutting board, wiping off the cutting board. If you are specifically going from raw to ready to eat food, that's not good enough. That cutting board has to be washed, rinsed, and sanitized. A lot of places have moved to a color-coded cutting board. It's hard to say, color-coded cutting board situation where a certain color is used for certain types of foods. For example, red is always used for red meats. Yellow is always used for seafood. White is always used for poultry, and green is always used for fresh or anything that's ready to eat, produce or anything already cooked. That certainly helps, but again, we still have to make sure cutting boards are washed, rinsed, and sanitized the way that they have to be. Poor personal hygiene is the number one most common way that foodborne illness occurs. The food handler is the common denominator. Whether food isn't thawed properly, whether it's not cooked properly, any of those things we talked about already, the common denominator here is the food handler. And that's who we have to make sure that we're the ones that are controlling what we can control. Make sure your employees know when they are too sick to come to work. We've all had a ton of education in this area in the past 6 months. So again, we're much more mindful of that than we've ever been before. And I actually don't see this as much in the senior living healthcare even world the way we see it in restaurants. Most of the time, healthcare institutions have some sort of paid time off, some sort of sick leave, PTO time, whatever your location calls it. But most of healthcare has a way where if employees are sick, unless they've used up all their days, they do have a way to get paid and not be at work. In the restaurant industry, 99% of the time, if they're not working, they're not getting paid. So we find employees that tend to work when they're too sick to work, because guess what? They've got mortgages, they've got daycares, they've got schools, they've got college. So they tend to work when they're absolutely just too sick and shouldn't work. So make sure your teams know any illness they have has to be reported, and they know when they're too sick to come to work. Failure to wash your hands properly. Again, we've probably done that more in the past 6 months than we ever have in our whole entire lives. Coughing, sneezing, smoking, eating in the kitchen, not properly cleaning our clothes, hair restraint, and we'll talk about that in just a couple seconds. Appropriate jewelry, which technically, according to ServSafe, is a plain band ring. We shouldn't have earrings. We shouldn't have bracelets, necklaces, all the things that we want to wear to accessorize. If we're working in the kitchens, we just can't. Of course, employees need to bathe daily, covering sores, burns, and cuts appropriately. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those in a second. Making sure your team begins work clean. And one way you can do this is to have some sort of regular in-services for everybody. Years ago, probably 20 years ago, I had a situation with an employee where I was a manager. I had about 40 employees in my kitchen, and I did have a cashier that had some struggles, and I was able to do in-services for the whole team without having to embarrass or single someone out. And I actually went out and got the little travel sized soaps and deodorants, and really it was something fun to give, and it was something fun we could all do without me having to single one person aside. So there's all sorts of creative ways you can have those conversations without having to have those conversations. Hand washing, of course, make sure that hands are being washed properly before employees start work, anytime they're preparing or serving food, anytime they change tasks, anytime they drop something on the floor, anytime they touch their cell phones, etc., etc. Keeping fingernails short, clean, and free from nail polish. I had a cook in this same location that told me she spent way too much money on her nails for me to tell her she couldn't have them. And I very much explained right back to her that I totally get that, and we'll just have to find you another job, not in food service, because you're not going to get to work in food service as a cook or a server or in any situation where you're touching food or serving food with really long fingernails. It can't be done. It's just not sanitary. It's not clean. Every single person on this call has gone through probably a drive-through or been in a restaurant where the server had extremely ridiculously long fingernails, and it's just not okay. In your food preparation areas, you need to make sure that fingernails are kept short, no fake nails, so that they cannot contaminate the food. You're just eliminating the potential for risk there. No smoking, eating, drinking, chewing gum, of course, while preparing or serving food. We talked about covering sores, cuts, and burns. If you have a cut on your hand or your arm, it needs to be covered with a Band-Aid or bandage, and then covered with a glove or a gauze, wherever it is on your arm, wrapped if it's on your arm, or with gloves on your hand. So make sure that any kind of cuts or burns or sores are being covered properly. Wearing appropriate hair restraints. I get lots of questions about hair restraints. Technically, the rule is that hair restraints have to be worn in the food preparation area. So I've many times from this group have been asked, do we have to wear hair nets in the dining room? Technically, no, that is not a food preparation area. Again, you may have a facility policy that is completely different from that. And as long as your facility policy is more stringent than the ServSafe requirement, then you're totally okay. So hair restraint does not say hairnet. It doesn't say surgical bouffant cap. It doesn't say headband. It doesn't say bandana. It says a hair restraint. So a hair restraint for me would look very different than a hair restraint for my boss, who has very short hair. Okay, so hair restraint is exactly what it is. If you're an administrator or executive director, director of any kind, when you walk into your kitchen in your facility, please go ahead and put on a hair restraint, because you're imitating the behavior you want everybody to imitate. And if you're walking through there with pretty long flowing hair, then it is your teams aren't going to be as inclined to follow the rules too. One thing we did at the facility I was at years ago is we took, I call them little chip clips with the magnet on the back of them, and it worked because our door frames were metal, so the magnet would adhere to it. And we took hair nets and we put them inside that metal clip, and we just put it right there by the door. I have been in customers' accounts where when I walk up to the kitchen door, I ask for a hairnet if I don't have one with me. And they literally point me to the storeroom, which is all the way past the tray line, past the stoves on the other side of the kitchen to get a hairnet out of the storeroom. Kind of defeats the purpose. So you want to make sure that you have appropriate hair restraints, whatever that might be, available at your doors, so that whoever is coming in your kitchens, and it doesn't matter who it is, if it's a salesperson like me, and I haven't managed, I've been with US Foods almost over 15 years now, so it's been a long time since I managed a kitchen, but I can tell you this, I keep hair restraints in my briefcase, and if I come your way, I'm going to either ask for a hairnet or I'm going to already have one with me. So make sure that whoever's coming in, that you're asking them to follow your rules. And again, if you're administrative, once you walk in that kitchen, please do as you want everybody else to do. Food handling techniques. Hand washing, of course, is number one. Using utensils when handling food. One thing I had somebody in class one time say, well, we're supposed to use tongs, but we don't have any. All of ours are broken. Or we're supposed to use this tool or this, but we don't have any. We're supposed to use ladles, but we don't have any that are the right size. If you don't have what you need to do the job that you need to do, please make sure that your administrators, your owners, whoever is in the position to approve those items, because you can't ask your teams, don't handle food with your hands or with your gloves. You have to use tongs, but if you don't have tongs, then that's kind of impossible. So make sure that they have the tools to do the job. Keeping food covered and at the right temp, preventing cross-contamination, using sanitized work surfaces, of course. Again, that goes back to that cutting board I talked about. That can apply to a knife. Anything, we've got to make sure it's being properly washed, rinsed, and sanitized. Don't taste raw meat, poultry, or fish, and always get a couple of chuckles out of that one. I'm sure nobody is walking over to the refrigerator and says, I want to know what this big handful of ground beef tastes like raw. What happens is, and in the last section, we're going to talk about internal finished cooked temperatures. What they mean by that here is not checking the temperature to ensure that food has been cooked to the right internal temp before you do your taste test. So if you're cooking something, you need to make sure you check the temp to ensure it's been cooked properly before you taste it. Purchasing and storage. Of course, and I mentioned this, there's a few things we're going to mention a couple times because they're super important. Storing raw foods separate from ready-to-eat foods. Reject any food with an expired use by, sell by, or pull from date. And I also will say here, send back any food that will expire before you can use it. So if you know that it takes you 2 weeks to go through 2 containers of sour cream and it shows up at your door from your distributor with a 5-day date on it, reject it, send it back while the driver's there, because that way you can get product that has dates on it that will help, that you can use, and then they may have somebody who uses that much in a day or two. So just reject it while the drivers are there. Reject any product where your package has been damaged. Purchase pasteurized milk, eggs, and other dairy products. And I'm going to talk to you about pasteurized eggs in just a second. Pasteurized milk, any milk that you buy now from a distributor, from a grocery store, etc., is going to be pasteurized unless you're driving to a farm and personally purchasing unpasteurized raw milk. Then whatever milk you buy is pasteurized. And I'm sure nobody's going to buy raw milk and bringing it back to their facilities. Purchase from approved vendors, and that is going to be something that you've got to make sure that whoever you're buying from is an approved vendor. Just because your brother grows tomatoes in his backyard and he does a fine job, I'm sure, you cannot take his tomatoes and serve them in your facility unless he has the proper permits, license, inspections, etc., to make sure that you're getting quality, safe product. If you're buying food from a farmer's market, a commercial farmer's market, of course, that's an approved vendor. I have had customers tell me that their family members of their residents or even their staff wanted to bring in product, whether it be pies and cakes and things like that, or tomatoes, any kind of fresh produce. Technically, you have to purchase from an approved vendor. So keep those things in mind, especially we're coming out of summer now, but during the summer months, that's when we tend to see a lot of this. Let's talk about pasteurized eggs. If you are going to serve a product that has a raw or undercooked egg, you need to use a pasteurized egg. Most of you are probably using liquid eggs for some things and shell eggs for others. That's perfectly fine, unless you are serving maybe an over easy egg or an egg with a runny yolk. If you're doing that, you need to make sure you're buying pasteurized shell eggs. So the rule is pasteurized shell or pasteurized liquid frozen eggs or egg products have to be used if you're making your own Caesar salad dressing, hollandaise, mayonnaise. Most of us probably aren't doing that. Where I see this for the most part is with over easy eggs, poached eggs, anywhere where it's going to have a runny or undercooked yolk. If you are willing to serve an egg that is undercooked, you need to use a pasteurized egg. If you're fully cooking your eggs, there is no rule that says you have to use a pasteurized egg, unless you have a long-term skilled nursing facility that you service. Maybe you're attached to a skilled nursing facility or a CCRC, continuing care, retirement, community situation where you have multiple levels of care, because in the nursing home industry in Alabama, they require pasteurized eggs 100%. If you're assisted living and you're not attached to a skilled nursing facility, as long as you're not serving a raw or undercooked egg, you're good. Utensil care, I've talked a lot about this. No chips, no cracked dishes. Be sure when we're serving that we're not touching the food contact surface of the dishes. That goes back, kind of makes me think of the person with the really long fingernails too. It's real hard to grab the side of a plate and serve that platter of food without touching the food contact surface if your fingernails are 3 or 4 inches long. Serve glasses with the rim down, flatware with the handles in the same direction. A lot of us may be still using disposables. Again, keep in mind, these are things we need to remember once we're back to full speed ahead, which hopefully will be sooner than later. Utensils and dishes, our sanitizing procedure, there's 2 different ways that your utensils and equipment can be sanitized. It's going to either be hot water or chemical. That's it. There's 2 ways. If you don't know, go back to your facility and find out. You definitely need to know whether you use hot water or chemicals. I can tell you, you don't need both. So don't let a chemical company tell you that you need a chemical sanitizer if you are using hot water to sanitize, because all you're doing is just, you're killing the sanitizer with the temperature of the water. So it's going to be either, it's going to be hot water or chemicals to sanitize. Different types of chemical sanitizers require different contact times. They require different parts per million. There are different test strips that go with a different type of sanitizer. So make sure if you use chlorine to sanitize, you're using a chlorine test strip. Iodine, use an iodine test strip. Quaternary ammonium or quartz, that you're using a quartz test strip. So just be sure that you know if it's hot water or if it's chemicals, and if it's a chemical, that you're using the proper test strip to go with the chemical that you're using. Record keeping, your water temperatures and your chemical concentrations, whatever the case may be, should be monitored, documented prior to dishwashing, and kept on file for 3 months. I have lots of people ask me, when do I have to check either the concentration or the water temperature? And the answer is prior to dishwashing. So I'm going to bet that you wash dishes 3 meals a day. So you should have a log that has the time, a spot for the temperature, a spot for your employees' initials. And those are things that your survey teams are going to want to see when they come in. And if you use a dish machine, whether it's an under-counter dishwasher or a commercial dishwasher, just make sure that you are keeping a record of your temperatures or your chemical concentrations, whatever that may be. And y'all remember, if you have any questions, you can type those questions in at any time. All right, I'm going to go over the same questions that we talked about briefly in the very beginning, and I'm going to bet that you're going to know the answers to these now. I kind of just hit the high points of them before, but I'm actually going to read through them exactly how you're going to see them on the test. Foodborne illnesses are preventable if proper precautions are taken. That is a true, false question. Foodborne illnesses are preventable if proper precautions are taken, and that is true. We definitely can prevent foodborne illness if we do what we're supposed to do and what we know we're supposed to do. Improper storage of food is a potential source of contamination and spoilage. True or false? Improper storage of food is a potential source of contamination, and that is true. If we're not storing food properly, we could contaminate it. Examples: storing chemicals with our food, storing our raw meat above our lettuce in the refrigerator. Those are just two off the top of my head. Improper storage of food certainly is a potential risk for contamination. True or false, as long as a food does not have an off taste, smell, or odor, we can assume that it's safe. As long as a food does not have an off taste, smell, or odor, we can assume it's safe, and that is false. Again, you may have eaten the best chicken salad you've ever eaten in your entire life and be as sick as you've ever been in your entire life. So you definitely, just by smelling it, can't tell. Salmonella is a biological hazard, and that is true. Remember, the biological hazards are the salmonellas, E. coli, listeria, all the big words that we see on TV. They're anything that these don't change the taste, the smell, the odor, the texture, any of that of the foods. So biological hazards, yes, an example definitely would be salmonella. Staphylococcus is another one that could be considered a biological hazard. To prevent foodborne illnesses from chemical hazards, we need to store chemicals in a cabinet separate from food. The next question is, a typical case of cross-contamination by salmonella might involve So an example of cross-contamination by salmonella would be cooked poultry touching a surface that was contaminated by raw poultry. So, you know, if you're baking something in the oven side by side and they're not touching each other, but if you are allowing cooked, ready-to-eat product to come into contact with a surface where raw poultry was, then that is definitely a cross-contamination situation. The best place to store insecticide, that would be bug spray of any kind, would be with your other chemical solutions. So you're going to see that. When storing raw meat in a refrigerator, it is most important. The very most important thing, the number one thing you need to remember with storing raw meat in any refrigerator is it needs to be stored below any ready-to-eat or ready-to-serve products. Bottom shelf, below anything else that's ready to eat. Light fixtures in the food prep area need to be well shielded to prevent the food from shattered bulbs. So we keep our light fixtures shielded to prevent food from shattered bulbs. Okay, we're going to move into section 2. Do we have any questions? Okay. All right, so let's move into section 2, proper hand washing. And I know y'all have had tons of training on hand washing. Like I said, the past 6 months, I am going to go through it pretty quickly. And I can tell you this, there's no new information on how to wash your hands. It's always been the way it is. We've always had to wash our hands for a certain amount of time under running water for it to be considered clean. So hopefully this will serve as a reminder. Some of the questions you're going to see, I'm going to kind of go through high points on this pretest, and then I'll go over them again at the end like I did before. It takes just 5 seconds to properly wash your hands. Of course, that's false. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about removing cups and glasses and not touching the rim, what type of paper towels that we need to use, which sinks we can use to wash our hands in. When are sanitizing solutions okay? And when to use gloves. So those are going to be some of the things I'm going to go over here. Proper hand washing is the #1 single best way to prevent the spread of infection, whether it's foodborne or otherwise. Proper hand washing is the #1 best way to prevent the spread of infection. Foodborne pathogens cause up to 80 million cases of illness in our country alone every year. 70% of those come from the food service industry. That means that 30% of those are happening in our own homes. And I can tell y'all this, that's only what's reported. It's probably double that if everything were reported and tested. Like I said in the very beginning, we just assume we ate some bad food the night before, or we maybe drank too many margaritas at the Mexican restaurant. But we just don't report foodborne illness as often as it really happens. We also don't wash, well, we probably do now, but typically people don't wash their hands as often as they think they do. COVID has certainly changed that. Thankfully, it's changed our perspective on hand washing and personal hygiene 100%, which is fabulous. Let's talk about when we should wash our hands when we're working with food. Of course, before we start work, whether we're coming back from a break, whether we're just getting to work, after using the restroom, smoking, after eating, drinking, after touching money. We all have that favorite sub shop that we see just take our money and then throw on different gloves. I'll talk about gloves in a second, but that's not good enough. You have to have clean hands inside those gloves. After handling raw or cooked foods, touching our face, sneezing, coughing, touching our apron. And it is inevitable that just when you get ready to start serving, your head's going to itch, your eye's going to itch, your nose is going to itch, you're going to sneeze. It happens. And we just got to make sure that we're properly washing our hands, taking out the garbage, handling any kind of dirty dishes. A great example of this is the place where I worked years ago. I typically had 2 people in the dish room. It was a very large commercial dish machine where the food carts came in one side, the dirty dishes went into the dish machine, the clean dishes came out the other side. So dirty dishes and clean dishes never crisscrossed. That was all fine and dandy until somebody didn't show up for work, and the same person had to load the dishwasher and get the clean ones from the other side. When that happens, you have to make sure that your teams know that they have to properly wash their hands in between touching dirty and clean dishes. If you were to ask your teams, should you wash your hands in between touching dirty and clean dishes, they're absolutely going to tell you yes. But we get in a hurry, we're frustrated because somebody didn't show up for work, etc. So we've got to make sure that they are conscious of that and are washing their hands multiple times. After combing our hair, after cleaning or sanitizing something. Sometimes we think if we have sanitized something, our hands are clean. Well, we still need to wash our hands after that. And then after bussing or cleaning tables, of course. Every kitchen should have a hand washing station. The hand washing sink should not be used to prepare food, and the food prep sink should not be used to wash your hands. The hand sink should be removed from the food prep area. It should have disposable paper towels, hot and cold water, soap dispensers with soap in them, and a trash can. I can tell you, I was just this morning in a customer account, and I went into the restroom, and someone had taken sticky notes and put them on the paper towel dispensers and the soap dispensers. Housekeeping, please add soap, or housekeeping, please change the batteries in this. So make sure that your teams have a place to wash their hands that are equipped with soap, hot water, and disposable towels to dry their hands. When I used to have regular health department surveys, the very first thing the surveyor would do when she walked in my kitchen is she walked straight to the hand sink and turned the hot water on. Then she would come or go do something else, come and tell me, hey, I'm here, whatever the case may be. And then she would go back over and check to make sure the water was hot. So it's extremely important that you do have hot water available for hand washing, hot and cold water. Sanitizing solutions, that's hand sanitizers, can be used after hand washing, but they cannot be used to replace hand washing. Now, we've all gone hand sanitizer crazy the past few months, and rightfully so. But still, the number one best thing we can do is wash our hands. That may not always be an option if you're in and out of your car, different things like that. But if we are preparing food, we have to make sure that we are not using a hand sanitizer instead of washing our hands. We still have to properly wash our hands. Let's talk about how you do it. Of course, it takes more than 5 seconds, like that very first question I read earlier. Hands need to be moistened, the exposed parts of your forearms as well, with hot running water. Soap, lather, wash for 20 seconds by rubbing your hands together under your fingernails, ring, that sort of thing. The whole entire process should take 20 seconds. Okay, 10 to 15 seconds of active scrubbing, but from the time you start and wet your hands, it should be a 20-second process. We've all heard different songs we can sing. Whatever it takes. Rinse hands, forearms, dry your hands with a single-use towel. if you're old enough, you remember old country gas stations that used to have this towel that would just roll. It was not a disposable towel. It was a cloth towel, and you just rolled it to a different section to dry your hands. I can't even imagine why we ever thought that was okay. So definitely not okay. It's got to be a disposable towel. And of course, turn off the water, touch the doorknob with a towel instead of your clean hands. Using scoops, tongs, spatulas, even steel to handle food instead of our hands. I'll talk about wearing gloves. Here's fingernails coming up again. Acrylic nails, nail polish, of course, it can all break off into food. And then the same thing we talked about with personal hygiene. Avoid touching food contact surfaces. And if you're too sick to come to work, hand washing is so important. Mandatory use of gloves is not necessarily the answer. Don't let that be all you hear me say. What I mean by that is microorganisms can contaminate gloves just like they can your hands. So if you are not properly wearing gloves and properly washing your hands, just telling somebody you have to wear gloves isn't going to solve your problems. I used to teach a food safety class with a guy locally in Montgomery, and he kind of did his own little survey one time, and for about 2 or 3 months, every time he ate out, and this has been 10 or 11 years ago, every time he ate out, he asked the server or the cook, whatever situation was, why do you wear gloves? Just question, why do you even wear gloves? 9 out of 10 of them told him to keep their hands clean. That was their thought process, is I'm wearing gloves to keep the food from getting my hands dirty. When in all actuality, we need to wear gloves because we want to protect other people from us potentially contaminating food. So 9 out of 10 people told him, I wear gloves to keep my hands clean. That's kind of scary. So we want to make sure they know that they have to wear gloves to keep and prevent foodborne illness and contamination. So if we don't wash our hands before we put gloves on, then the outside of the gloves can become contaminated. 80% of vinyl food grade gloves have microscopic tears in them. So what that means is bacteria, microorganisms can pass back and forth from dirty hands that are inside those gloves to the outside of those gloves. Microscopic means we can't see it, but it's there. So the insides of gloves are warm, they're moist. Microorganisms love warm and moist environments. So if you put on gloves without properly washing your hands, all you have done is made a pair of dirty gloves. You've not solved any problems. So make sure that your teams are properly hand washing before they put on gloves. Then they're not touching their face, garbage, we talked about this, raw meats, equipment, picking up items, all of those things. The National Restaurant Association says we need to change our gloves as soon as they're soiled, before beginning a new task, at least every 4 hours during continual use. And I always laugh at that because my first instinct is, yeah, good luck with that. How many of us have ever been able to do anything in our kitchen for 4 hours without getting interrupted at all? Probably almost 0%. And then, of course, after handling raw meat or before handling any ready-to-cook foods. They did do a study, the Restaurant Association did, and actually discovered that bare hands that were washed every hour and sanitized were actually cleaner than those that wore gloves. I'm certainly not telling you not to wear gloves. The point I'm making there is this. We've got to make sure our teams know why we wear gloves, and we still got to have clean hands inside those. We do have a few customers that have a bell in their kitchen that every hour will ring, or some of them have it set to every 2 hours. It rings, and when that little bell rings inside that kitchen, everybody there stops what they're doing and they go wash their hands. No matter what they're doing, they stop and they go wash their hands. It's just a reminder to properly wash our hands, change our gloves, etc. So let's go over some of the questions that I promise you will see again. Again, if you need a certificate for this class, you're going to have to go on the link and do the SurveyMonkey exam, and then you will get your certificate sent out to you after that. So true or false, it takes just 5 seconds to properly wash your hands with soap and water. Of course, that's false. True or false, when removing cups and glasses from the dish rack, firmly place your fingers around the rim. When removing cups and glasses from the dish rack, place your fingers around the rim. And that is false. You want to make sure you don't put your hands on the rim, that you hold the outside of the glass. It's better to use cloth rather than paper towels to dry your hands. Cloth is definitely not better. That's false. You want a disposable paper towel instead of cloth. It's very important to wash your hands after handling raw food. Absolutely true. You may use the food prep sink to wash your hands. No, that's false. We have to have a hand washing sink that is not used for food and a food sink that is not used for hand washing. Sanitizing solutions should not be used to replace hand washing, and that is true. They should not be used to replace hand washing. They can be used after hand washing, but not in place of hand washing. You should always wash your hands after smoking, sneezing, handling dirty plates, all of the above. Okay? When handling food, it is important to make sure that you cover cuts with bandages and plastic gloves. Remember, I said that even in the very first session. You have to make sure that you have a bandage and then a secondary cover on any kind of cuts or burns. The hand washing station should have soap. It should have hot and cold water. It should have a disposable towel and a waste basket. And when using gloves in the food service area, always remember, replace them between raw and ready to eat. Okay? Questions? Okay. And if y'all have questions, please send them to me. All right, our very last section, we're going to talk about actual finished cooking temperatures. This one gets a lot more detailed on the actual cooking process. So those of you who are not in the kitchen cooking on a day-to-day basis, this is going to seem a little more detailed than you probably were expecting. But if you are back there cooking every day, you need to know these temperatures. So we're going to talk about temperature regulations and how I can hopefully help you make it simpler than it seems. All right, a few things we're going to talk about is how we can thaw foods, the importance of thawing, the actual finished cooking temperature of items, thermometers, what types of thermometers we can use, the danger zone, and holding and cooling food. We'll talk about leftovers and what we need to do. The time temperature principle, easiest thing to remember, that danger zone is 41 to 135. So hot food hot, cold food cold. That's the easiest way I can say to remember it, is we've always been taught hot food hot, cold food cold. Hot food 135 or above, cold food 41 degrees or less. Thawing foods under refrigeration in a refrigerator at 41 degrees or less is the way that your regulations tell you that it shall be thawed. It means we have to have adequate refrigeration space. We've got to have our menus planned, which we have to anyway. And it also means we're not going to come in on Friday morning and have frozen catfish thawed out and ready for lunch on Friday. Because if we've got to thaw it in a refrigerator, there has to be advanced planning. My recommendation here is this: whatever your menu is, take your menu, look at it, get your center of the plate items, your meats, those things that take time to be thought out. Make you a list for your cooks, or I call it the back of the house, the kitchen. Make a list of items. For example, if you have a menu from Sunday through Saturday, that's your menu you're serving. Have you a separate list for the cook on Sunday that tells her what to pull from the freezer? Because what you've done is looked at what you have on maybe Tuesday and you see that there's ham. So you're telling her on Sunday, go ahead and pull that ham out. Don't expect your staff to have to look at your menus and decide and think ahead. Go ahead and write it out. I always called it my pull from the freezer menu, or your pull from menu, whatever you want to call it. Look at your menu 48 to 72 hours ahead of whatever is being served. Put that on a list for your cooks and your team in the back of the house so they know what to pull. One lesson I learned here is I did this and I put a person's name beside it. And I came in one day and as a manager and it wasn't done. And I asked the person cooking that day, why didn't you pull this yesterday? And her response is, well, you said Mary had to pull it. Well, Mary was the cook that was scheduled, but since she called out sick and you covered her shift, I guess I was naive enough to think that you would know you had to pull it. So I recommend, because I learned the hard way, make sure that you put a position, cook 1, cook 2, AM cook, PM cook, whatever you have to do instead of a person's name, because I definitely made that mistake. So just make yourself a pull from the freezer menu that goes along with your menu, and that way you will know, they will know and not have to look ahead. I do have a question here. Let's see, can we use an ice bath or only by refrigeration? In going by your regulations and the way they read, it says food shall be thawed under refrigeration. Now, an ice bath would be more for cooling food, more so than thawing food out. So that may be the confusion there. And I will talk about ice baths in just a second, because that's going to be used for cooling food down. Maybe you've cooked a food and you're trying to cool it down so that you can put it in the fridge to use as leftovers or use later. But technically, you should be thawing food in the refrigerator in assisted living. This gets to be a little bit tough too, because if you're attached, like I said, to a retirement community that may have a skilled nursing unit, right now, their regulations say that they can thaw under running water. That is cold running water. Ours don't. So for right now, it's under refrigeration. Sorry about that. This is where if we were all in class together, y'all would all laugh. So if you have more questions about that, send that through to us. Okay. We're going to talk about the finished cooking temperature of different types of food. I want y'all to be able to know where to find this information. And when I finish, I'm going to give you my email. And if you want me to email you a copy of this presentation, I will be happy to. And if you want me to send you any of the food safety, ServSafe allows me to send finished cooking temperature posters and things like that. And when I say poster, I'm going to email it to you and you're going to have to print it right now. But I'll be happy to share anything that I have with you, and I'll give y'all my email address before we're finished. One thing I can tell you here is we have to check the finished cooking temperatures to know if food is done. And the only way to know if a food has reached the right temperature is to have a thermometer and check the temperature. Sounds pretty basic and elementary, but I can tell you this. I was doing an in-service for a team of people at a facility, And I had a cook that had been there for a very long time tell me she didn't need a thermometer. And I promise y'all, I've heard comedians say this for years. The truth is, we don't have to make up comedy. We live it every day. The truth is definitely sometimes scarier than anything we can make up. She said to me, I don't use a thermometer. I just stick my finger in the middle of it and I can tell if it's hot enough. She was dead serious. She was also the person who had been there the longest, and the manager had to train. That's who trained every new person who came in. So don't just assume that your veterans are doing everything the right way. We've got to make sure that we're properly and regularly in servicing all of our staff. So in order to check the temperature of anything, you have to have a thermometer. And I can't tell you how many times I've been asked to come in and do a quick in-service or help, clarify this or clarify that. And I'm like, okay, well, where's your thermometer? It's either locked in a manager's office, it's buried so deep in the back of a drawer in the kitchen that, who knows the last time it was retrieved and actually used. I can tell you this, and I've got a sample right here. It's going to be hard for y'all to see, but I'm going to try. This thermometer right here is called, we call it a nail head thermometer or a bimetallic stemmed thermometer. Those cost you about $2, probably even less than that on some of your contracts. I know that there is a new GPO partner with the Assisted Living Association, and I can tell you a 2-pack of those on that contract is about $3 or $4. So that's for a pack of 2. They're very, very inexpensive. They are still the most accurate thermometer that you can use. I recommend buying enough that every single person in your kitchen has easy access. My goodness, if they lose it, you haven't lost a ton. Now, if you want to invest in digital thermometers and things like that, you certainly can, but you're talking about $2 versus $20. Grand scheme, that adds up. But these nail head or bimetallic stemmed thermometers, is what they're technically called, are your best bet, the best bang for your buck. So let's talk about minimum internal cooking temperatures. Again, you can't just stick your finger in the middle of the food to know if it's done. I promise that's not the way to do it. We've all cut chicken in half to see if it wasn't pink anymore, but technically, certain foods should reach a certain temperature for us to know if they are quote unquote done. So poultry, stuffed meats, and casseroles need to be cooked to 165 degrees for 15 seconds. What this means is that's not the temperature of the oven. That's not the temperature you hold it at. But once your chicken Parmesan reaches 165 degrees for 15 seconds, then you hold it at 135 or above. This is the place where I have flip charts and I can use my hands and make it a lot easier for us. But poultry, stuffed meats, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you here, anything cooked in a microwave, no matter what it is, and anything that is being reheated. So if you've already cooked it once and you're using it from a leftover or you're reheating it, all of those items have to be cooked to 165 degrees. Real life example. The directions, the recipe says turn the oven on to 425, bake it for 30 minutes. That's fine. At about 20-25 minutes, you pull it out. You need to check the temperature and see if it has reached the proper temperature or not. Okay? Heidi, if you can hear me, they can't see the presentation they're saying. Okay, Heidi will work on that. So poultry, stuffed meats, anything cooked in a microwave, and anything reheated, 165 degrees. any type of ground meats, whether it is sausage, whether it is ground beef, thanks Heidi, whether it's sausage, ground beef, fish sticks, that would be a flaked fish. Easiest way to remember that is any type of meats where it's all crumbled up or ground up together, whether it's pork, hamburger, fish, whatever it is, if it's ground up, it needs to be cooked for 1 to 155 degrees. Okay. The third area, my way to remember this is this: whole muscle meats. That would be a ham, a pork roast, a beef roast, veal, lamb, a steak, a filet, anything that it's not all ground up. It is actually a whole muscle, a whole piece. Could be fish, and also shell eggs. Have to be cooked to 145 degrees. Okay, so poultry, stuffed meats, anything in a microwave, anything reheated, 165. Just think of it this way. You always think the number one food, back an hour and a half ago when I started, what's the first food you think of when you think of foodborne illness or foods that are potentially hazardous? Chicken is the first thing we think. Chicken is the most easily cross-contaminated, dangerous, if you will, food item. So it always is going to have to be cooked to the highest temperature. Okay. Remember, these are finished cooking temperatures, not holding temps and not serving temps. So you cook it to the proper temp, then you hold it out of the danger zone. If I cook that poultry, we'll just go back to chicken Parmesan and cook it to 165, and I put it in a holding box, a hot box, in the oven, wherever I'm holding it, and it stays at 165 or 175 or 185, I am continuing to cook that. So it's going to be tough and inedible. 165 means 165. And then you hold it out of the danger zone. The number one food that gets overcooked in my many years of experience in food service is pork chops. Pork chops, and I know there's probably lots of you nodding your heads right now. Pork chops is one of the biggest complaints I hear residents and patients alike complain about because they're tough. Pork chops would fall under that third bullet point right there, in that it's a whole muscle meat. So you would cook it to 145 degrees for 15 seconds. Then you hold it at 135 or above. It's got to be held out of the danger zone. What happens is when you cook that pork chop, that pork loin, that pork roast to 145, it's still going to be a little pink. And our residents don't want any pink pork chops. They think that it's not done, and I totally get that. But if we're cooking that pork until it is so white it looks like chicken, it is going to be tough. It's going to be like hockey pucks. So that's why in that case, I typically recommend doing some type of pork chop that has a gravy, a sauce, something that's going to help keep it moist, because it's just a tough item for us to cook and keep our residents happy with. All right. Proper thermometer use. I talked about thermometers. We talked about bimetallic and digital. I skipped ahead there. Bimetallic thermometers, again, inexpensive, range from 0 to 220 degrees. They have a calibration nut right up under that where you read the temperature, and that's how you're going to calibrate it. I'm going to tell you how to do that. If we were live in class, I'd show you. Digital thermometers, of course, very easy to read. It spits the number right out there to you. They are more expensive. So you decide what works best in your facility. As long as you have thermometers and they're calibrated regularly and they work and they're being used, it doesn't matter. So how do we calibrate a thermometer? There's two options. The easiest way is the ice point method. It's the most reliable because, as we all know, water boils at different temperatures. based on atmospheric pressure, altitude, etc. So I'm going to tell you how to calibrate a thermometer by using the ice point method. I'm not going to read all this to you. I'm just going to give you the high points. Go get a glass, fill it halfway with ice, finish filling it up with water. Take your thermometer, put it down in that glass, stir it around, and the dial on the top of that thermometer should read 32 degrees. Not 0, but 32. Plus or minus 1 degree is fine. If it doesn't read 32 degrees, and give the thermometer stem time to stop moving, it's not going to be immediate. It may take 30 seconds or so. But stir it around in that glass. If it does not read 32 degrees, take you a pair of pliers. While the thermometer is still in the ice water, twist it to where the dial, the needle, reads 32 degrees. I promise it sounds complicated. It's one of the simplest things you do. I always get the question, how often do we have to calibrate our thermometers? We need to calibrate the thermometers regularly is all it says. So I would say definitely your cooks need to calibrate when they start work that day. If the thermometer gets dropped, gets banged around, etc., then it needs to be recalibrated. I use a thermometer to cook every single day, and I calibrate it every single day before I check the temperature of whatever I'm cooking. I'm probably the extreme on that, but it takes 30 seconds, and I know then that it is reading correctly. So glass, half ice, finish filling it with water, put your thermometer in there, and it needs to read 32 degrees after the needle stops moving. If it doesn't, keep it in the ice water and get you a pair of pliers and twist the calibration nut that's right up under the head of the thermometer to the needle where it reads 32 degrees. I always liked when I was a director to, for one of my in-services, have a glass with ice water and a thermometer for everybody there. And we actually did, it took about 10 minutes from start to finish. I actually walked them through an in-service and watched everybody calibrate a thermometer so that I knew everybody knew how. Because guess what? When you get a surveyor or an inspection of any kind, they're not going to come ask the food service manager, most likely, to calibrate a thermometer. They're going to ask the cooks, the tray line workers, the folks that are out there working with that food hands-on the whole entire time. That's who they're going to want to see and have proof that they know how to calibrate thermometers and they know when it's incorrect. You also need to make sure your teams know what the temperatures should be when they're checking temperatures. For example, what the poultry should be cooked to, what the refrigerator temperature needs to be for your logs, etc. I actually was in a facility one time and they asked us to do just a mock kitchen inspection, and they had this beautiful log on the front of the fridge and it had all the temperatures, where the refrigerator temperature was being checked and initialed. There was only 2 major things wrong with it. On about the 10th of the month, the refrigerator, it was written down that it was 47 degrees. Well, instead of that being addressed, someone had gone ahead and filled it out for the rest of the whole month that hadn't happened yet at 47 degrees. So obviously the temperatures weren't being taken for the days in the future unless they were telepathic and I didn't know it. But the staff didn't know that 47 was incorrect. So you need to make sure that your teams know what the right temperatures are and what to do, what corrective action to take if it's incorrect. Because once in a while, you're going to check the temp on that fridge and the door is going to have been left open, or you're going to check the temperature of a food you're cooking and it's not going to, it may say cook that chicken for 30 minutes. You pull it out at 30 and it's not even close to being 165. So you put it back in. They've got to know that just because it cooked the right amount of time, as long as it hasn't reached the right temp, you got to finish cooking it. So make sure your teams know what corrective action to take. Holding hot food, many times, of course, every day when we cook, we are going to cook food to the right internal temp, and then we're going to hold it out of the danger zone. I talked about this when I talked about finished cooking temps. We keep food in a preheated holding unit. A lot of us put it back in an oven to hold it. Just make sure it's being held out of the danger zone, but not continuing to cook, okay? If you're gonna hold food for more than 2 hours, you need to have a temperature log where you're checking that food at least after 2 hours. Most of us do not hold food for 2 hours. The only way I have ever really seen that is in a cafeteria style setting, and even then that food's turning, you know, that pot of lasagna isn't the same one, that pan's not the same as it was 2 hours ago. Also, make sure that your teams, if you're in a larger facility, are not using hot holding equipment to cook food. Great example here. We were invited in just to do a kitchen, a mock survey. I walked over, it was about 2:30 in the afternoon, so I knew the kitchen was closed. We walked in and I saw steam just bellowing out of one of the steam tables, and I'm like, is there food on that steam table? And they said, yeah. So I go over there and I lift the lid, and it's a big white frozen block of something. And I'm like, what is that? And they said, well, that's our cream potato soup for tonight. Your cream potato soup for tonight sitting on the steam table, and it's not even cooked. They said, well, yeah, we just pop it out frozen and we go ahead and put it on the steam table as soon as lunch is over. And by the time dinner comes, it'll be plenty hot by then. Not okay. We can't use hot holding equipment to cook our food. So make sure that we're cooking it before we put it in the steam table, the hot holding unit, okay? Let's see. Let's talk about holding cold foods. That's super easy. We're putting it in a cooler of some sort, right? So hot food hot, cold food cold. If we need to hold food in a cold holding unit, i.e. refrigerator, it needs to be 41 degrees or less, the refrigerator does, in a shallow pan, which is 2 inches deep or less. So shallow pans are 2 inches deep or less. We're making sure we're checking the temp if we're holding it more than 2 hours, keeping it covered, all the things that we do. And again, we're not holding food more than 2 hours. Let's talk about cooling food. And I believe this is probably what the question earlier about the ice bath was. Cooling food, we've got to cool food sometimes pretty quickly. And I'm going to go to the next slide. Cooling, how do we cool food? Let's say we've got a huge pot of soup and we need to cool it down pretty quickly. We're going to separate it into shallow pans, 2 inches or less. We're going to stir it. There's all sorts of equipment that you can have, blast chillers. There's paddles you can get. In some of our larger facilities, it's basically these giant paddles that have the same stuff in them that your lunchbox little ice pack does, that you freeze the whole paddle, and you can stir your soup with this giant frozen, paddle, and it helps cool it down from the inside so that your product that's right in the middle doesn't stay in the danger zone too long. Probably separating it into smaller portions or putting it in an ice bath are the two most common ways that we cool food. An ice bath is simply, you take a bowl, you fill it with ice, and then you take your pan or your bowl of whatever you're trying to cool and you put that bowl inside the ice bath. Some people will fill a sink and then put their bowl over. You just got to make sure that, of course, the ice bath isn't getting into whatever you're cooling. But while it's in an ice bath, you can stir it, move it into smaller portions, and that will help your food cool rapidly. What you don't want to do is take piping hot food and put it into a refrigerator. Two things can happen here. It can increase the temperature of the other food in your fridge and ruin everything in there. Or the food that is in the very middle, the very center. So let's say I have a giant roast. The roast right in the center of the roast, it likely could take hours overnight to even get it cooled down if it's really hot. So you want to break things like that into smaller portions so that it's not staying in the danger zone for too long. Reheating food, I mentioned this earlier. Anything you are reheating needs to be heated to 165. That's because it's already passed through that danger zone one time, and then you're cooling it back off, and then it's passing through again. So we always err on the side of caution with any leftovers. All leftover foods need to be labeled, dated, and consumed within 3 days. Leftover foods are this: potentially hazardous foods prepared on site. A gallon of mayonnaise or a jar of mayonnaise does not have to be used within 3 days of the day that you open it. This is a leftover. It's a potentially hazardous food prepared on site, and that's by definition. Potentially hazardous foods prepared on site. I have had tons of questions over the years of, well, we opened the ketchup today, do we have to use it by Wednesday? No, the ketchup has an expiration date. This is not a leftover. Ketchup is not a leftover. Leftovers are ground beef that you had that you are going to cool down and use in a shepherd's pie tomorrow. That's a leftover, okay? So keep that in mind and don't get too bogged down in leftovers. The last two slides are just temperatures to remember. And again, I'll be happy to send y'all this as a reference. The danger zone, your bimetallic stem thermometer ranges from 0 to 220 degrees. That is used to measure hot or cold food. The bimetallic stem thermometer is not used to measure the temperature of the grease in your fryer. They make a fryer thermometer for that. A bimetallic stem thermometer is not used to measure the oven temperature. You don't put it in the turkey and put the turkey in the oven and cook it with that thermometer in it. That's not what it's designed for. There are other thermometers designed for that. So keep that in mind. Let's see, shallow pans are 2 inches or less. Your danger zone is 41 to 135. And I'm going to go over the pretest because there will be some temperatures. And again, all these questions that we've gone over is exactly what you're going to see on your post-test. Meats can be thawed on the counter at room temperature for a few hours before moving them to the refrigerator to finish thawing. I'll read it again, true or false. Meat can be thawed on the counter at room temp for a few hours before moving it to a fridge to finish thawing. That's false. Of course, we don't thaw meat on the counter at room temperature ever. Number 2, chicken should be cooked to an internal temperature of 120. That's false. Chicken should be cooked to an internal temperature of 165. It is acceptable to thaw under refrigeration. That's true. And again, with assisted living, food shall be thawed under refrigeration. That's pretty much what they give us there. A standard bimetallic stem thermometer should range from 0 to 220. That is true. You should use 4-inch deep steam table pans, filling them to the top to cool leftover food. That is false. Remember I said a 2-inch deep pan is a shallow pan. 2-inch deep is a shallow pan. The temperature danger zone, you're going to need to know that, is 41 to 135. All poultry, stuffed meats, and stuffed pasta, poultry, stuffed meats, stuffed pasta should be cooked to 165 degrees for 15 seconds. The minimum internal temperature for ground beef and ground pork is 155. And if y'all will look, I don't think I was going to try to make it go back, but 155. So 165 is our poultry and stuffed meats, microwave, and leftovers. 155 is our ground products. So minimum internal cook temperature, ground beef, ground pork, 155. When holding hot food, that means we've already cooked it, we're holding it to serve later. What should we do? We should take the temperature every 2 hours. We're not going to hold it ever more than 4, and it needs to be held at 135 or above. All of those things are true. When cooling leftover chili, so this is cooling food, put the chili in a 2-inch deep pan. Chill it to 41 within 4 hours, and cover, label, date, all of those things. And again, y'all remember right here, these temperatures to remember are so important. And I'm going to give you my email if y'all want a copy of any of the signage. What I have is just in a big zip file, and you can go through it and print it out in color. ServSafe allows me to send that to y'all. You can print it out. Most customers laminate it. They'll print it in color, laminate it, and post it in their kitchens. I've had some blow it up into like a 10 by 17 or whatever, real big pieces. Whatever works for you, but my email is Pamela, Pamela dot buffet, B as in boy, ETHEA at usfoods.com. So one more time, Pamela, Pamela dot buffet, B as in boy, ETHEA at usfoods.com. If you will send me an email, I will turn right around and send you back any of the signage. I'll even send you copies of these pre-tests, not with the, without the answers, but if you want the pre-test to use for your teams so that you can go back and do in-services with your teams. My goal here is to give you the tools to train your staff. Whatever I can do to help you, just let me know. So send me an email. If there's anything you need from me, anything I can help with, please, I will be happy to answer any questions that I can. And as different as this was, I hope to see every one of you real soon. And I just thank you all for your time. Thanks.